All right, hey guys, welcome back to another edition of Hey Guys. Today we're going to be soldering. We're going to use a soldering iron and we're going to use some electrical flux, and I'm going to show you how to solder together some wires, two different ways, and how to solder wires onto one of your smaller electrical components. So, lot to check out. This really isn't that hard. We'll get right into it. All right, so first thing when we are soldering is we want to make sure that we're keeping our area clean, and that we have a place to put our soldering iron. So, and what I mean by that is that you should have some sort of soldering stand. Now, just if you buy just a straight up soldering iron, usually it comes with like a little metal stand. That's good. Anything that keeps the tip up off of the table and from rolling around is a good thing. Now I'm using this Weller soldering station, and what I like about this is it's easy to turn it on and off. I don't have to worry about plugging it in or unplugging it. It has the aforementioned metal stand to hold my gun. It holds it really secure and it keeps it safe. And it comes with this little sponge tray, which I'll get into more in just a second. So I want you to keep in mind when we're soldering that all of this metal part, when our soldering iron is heated up, is hot, and all of it will burn you. You can see that, you know, it's been blued a little from the heat. You definitely want to avoid touching that. I've seen it happen before where people have dropped their soldering iron and tried to catch them. I want to tell you, you got about a 50-50 chance of which end you're going to grab. The best thing to do is just get out of the way and let it fall. Once it's fallen and hit the ground, then you can pick it up quickly, but then you have a little bit more control over what you're grabbing. All right, so the most important thing to remember when we're soldering is keeping our tip clean, because as soon as we're done soldering, oxidation is going to start to build up on the tip. You can see that the tip looks kind of dark gray. We want to keep that tip wiped off. The easiest way is with just a damp sponge. It's cheap, it's easy, it's safe, it's not a problem. You can spend more money on those like copper sponges or whatever they call them, but I personally think that that's unnecessary. All right, so the next thing you want to make sure of is that you're using the right kind of solder. I prefer using a lead-free solder, and you want to make sure that it says that it's for electrical. All right, don't solder with plumbing solder, right? That's totally different. The next thing is you want to make sure that it has a rosin core. What the rosin does is the rosin is a flux that's going to clean the components that it's coming up against as it goes on. It's like a little acid, and it's going to make it so that the solder flows a lot better. All right, so that's that, and that's that. So I've already cut some wires and stripped them off. The first way I'm going to show you for putting two wires together is after I've stripped them off, I'm not going to do anything to the ends of the wire. So I'm using stranded wire, and I recommend for your electrical components that you always use stranded wire and not solid wire. Solid wire is great for house wiring, but it's not so great for doing electronics. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm literally pushing the two ends together so that the wires intertwine with each other. And I'm going to tell you why I like this technique in just a second. So I'm going to twist these together like this, and then that makes those wires all kind of running into each other. They're making good contact with each other. And the reason I really like this is, in most cases, I'm not doing this today, but in most cases, when you're soldering together electrical components like this, you are going to put some heat shrink tubing over this. You want to always remember to put the heat shrink tubing over the wires before you solder them together when you're soldering components together. You can't put it on afterwards, so you always have to remember that. Very important. So with this kind of connection like this, it's very easy to slip that heat shrink tubing back over this once it's soldered, shrink it down, and there's no lumps. It fits perfectly, and it's done and it's clean. I'm going to show you another way in just a minute that certainly will have its place in your soldering, but as much as possible, I think you should try to do it this way. All right, so to get this soldered, what I'm going to do first, so I've got my solder here. I'm holding my wires with this helping hands because I need both of my hands in this case. So what I'm doing right now is I'm wiping off the tip of my soldering iron. Then I'm going to take and I'm going to put some solder on my tip, and we call this tinning the solder, right? Now, you see a lot of smoke coming off. That is the rosin burning off. It burns off rather quickly. So I'm going to wipe a lot of that excess solder off of my tip. I'm going to put some fresh on because now I want to get working right away. So the reason that I just put solder on my tip is to allow more heat to transfer into the wires. Now you can see the idea here is that we're going to heat up those wires. So I held the soldering iron with the solder on it. Now I'm not expecting that solder to be the solder that actually does the soldering. What I'm doing with that solder is I'm using that to be able to transfer more heat into the wires. The idea with soldering is that the solder likes to go where it's hot. So if I hold this on here for a second first, and then I get the wires to heat up for just a second, it really doesn't take that long, then I can take my new solder and I can touch it right where the soldering iron and the wires meet. That new solder will melt and flow, and because those wires were preheated just for a second, it's going to flow out in between that wire, and I can keep adding more solder and moving my soldering iron around until I feel like it's sufficient. And then we have a really nice solder joint. We slide on a piece of heat shrink tubing on this, and we shrink it down, and we'll never know that there's a solder joint in there. It'll be nice and smooth. Now you can see it really holds on tight. Again, I can't tell you enough. You gotta go quick. The biggest mistake people make is either heating for too long or using too much solder. So don't heat for too long. Just heat for about a second. Put the solder on. Don't put too much solder on. You can see it flowing through all the wires. When you see it flowing through the wires, it's done. Okay? Pull away. Pull that soldering iron out of there. Pull that solder out of there. You're done. All right? This is a great joint right here. Worked really well. All right, so the other way, this is the way that I have done it previously, is I will put my two wires side by side. I will take and twist them together. Now, I'm using heavier gauge wire, so it's easier for you to see what I'm doing. This is 16 gauge wire, which is very beefy wire. This is probably thicker than most wires I would use in a project unless I was using some pretty high voltage and high current. 16 gauges can handle about 10 amps of power, so, or maybe even a little bit more. All right, so I'm twisting them together like this, like a wishbone. I'm gonna hold this on here so that you can see what I'm doing. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna solder that little end right there. I'm gonna do this exactly the way I did this before. So again, we wipe back our tip. We look at our tip, it looks nice and silvery, so we're good to go in that respect. We're gonna put some solder onto our soldering iron, put our soldering iron up underneath our wires, hold it for a second, and then start to add some solder. You can see how quickly the solder goes into the wires. Didn't take that long. Did you see how fast that was? That was super fast. And then we're done. It should only take that long. You just hold it on there. You have to just trust that it's heating it up enough There's nothing to tell. There's nothing to look at that changes in the wire that lets you know that it's hot enough. So again, just hold it for a second. Hold it for a second. You've got that little blob of solder on there that's helping transfer the heat. Trust that it's doing its job. Stick that solder in there in between the iron and what you're soldering. It'll begin to flow immediately. It will flow right on what you're trying to solder. All right, so the last thing I would do to finish this off is I would take some wire cutters and I would cut some of this extra off so I have a little bit smaller piece. And then see, this is why I'm not tremendously crazy about this system. So what I would do then is then fold it over like that, slide my heat shrink tubing over that joint and solder it down. And I'd have a hump right there, but I would know that that was connected and it was doing a good job. All right. So what about these little components? These little components look like that could be kind of a nightmare to solder, those little legs right there. Well, you can see that I've already spread those legs out. That way I can get to them a little bit better. There's a couple of things. Most of it's just exactly the same as it was before. But there's going to be a couple of things I'm going to do that are a little bit different when we're soldering wires to components. Soldering and wires together is watering, apparently. All right, so I'm going to put my little piece right there in my helping hands. And I'm going to take a piece of wire. So this wire is more appropriate size wire that you would probably be using. This is 22 gauge wire. The way this component is to be wired is this will be ground, and both of these two are one's positive in, one's positive out. So I'm going to put a black wire on that ground. Maybe I'll start with one of the positives so I can just work my way around 1, 2, 3. All right, so I'm going to take my wire. Now I've changed my mind. I'm going to take my red wire. I'm going to twist it up so that the wire is kind of one piece this time. I'm going to do that first. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-solder the wire. I'm going to get solder on the wire. That's going to help with heat. That's also going to help with the solder flow from the next one. So I'm going to take my soldering tip. I'm talking too long, so I got to go a little bit quicker. I'm going to put some solder on my soldering tip. Come right up underneath that wire, and then just right away put some solder on there. And now you can see that there is some solder on the tip of the wire, on that whole end. All right, so now I'm going to just lay this up. This is where these helping hands sometimes really come in handy. So I can get those two kind of together. A couple little adjustments. What I want is I just want them laying on top of each other so that they're touching each other, right? So that's touching. But I'm not trying to twist it around or anything like that. So I'm going to clean up my tip. Always clean your tip. You're constantly wiping your tip down. Put a little solder on my tip, come up underneath, don't get that other one, and then just lickety split, man. It only takes a second and you are soldered on there. So touch the tip with the solder on it, add a little bit more solder to get a little bit more resin flowing, and we've got it. All right, let's do the black wire. You can tell soldering is pretty quick, it's pretty easy. The biggest things, as I keep saying, is don't try to go too fast, or don't try to go too slow. Don't think that you got to heat it up a ton. You don't have to heat it up a ton. Keep your soldering tip clean. Keep fresh solder going. Don't think that you can solder with old solder on your tip. It doesn't work that way because it's got to have that resin to make it flow. So we put a little solder on our wire, kind of pre-tin our wire. Move this wire into place. Get it to lay right next to the part on the component where it needs to solder. Clean my tip again. Always cleaning the tip. Every time you pick up the soldering iron, you should go to clean it. Put a little dab of solder on. Came loose. I'm going to use the solder to help hold it. And there we go. It's just that fast, man. It only takes a couple of seconds. Just a couple of seconds. Now, I'd go ahead and finish soldering on that last wire, but you get the idea, right? All right, so just to recap, keep wiping your soldering iron off. Keep putting it back in the holder so it doesn't burn any of your wires. It'll burn your wires quick. It'll burn your hand quick. If you drop the soldering iron, let it fall, then pick it up where you have more control. Again, tip clean, add a little fresh solder so it's got some fresh rosin going. Put it on the part that you want to solder together. Just hold it for a second and then add new solder. You have to do the add new solder part because that is what puts more rosin in there. That's what's going to make the solder flow and work perfectly. All right? Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
So wrap me in plastic and make me shine. We can make a dollhouse for your design.